and the renewable energy project finance space. And outside of work, I also started a small environmental charity called Solar Schools Canada. So today, Tim, Amanda from EOS Energy, and myself will be talking about kind of the differences between nonprofit organizations and registered charities. And the first part of the kind of presentation will walk you through sort of the technical distinctions between those two types of organizations. And then in the second part, it will really be open for questions from you, and Amanda and I can talk through our experience of working together to navigate the charity application process. And I'm really looking forward to hopefully a good kind of interactive exchange once the substantive presentation is done, and to getting to know each of you and your organizations. So next slide, Tim, please. So in the presentation, or can you go back to the outline, Tim? So we'll talk about, what is a nonprofit organization? What is a registered charity? Some sample charitable purposes for environmental organizations, when to apply for charitable status, when not to apply for charitable status, how to apply, and then select compliance obligations. Next slide, please, Tim. So a nonprofit organization is what many organizations start out as. And a nonprofit organization, it's not a legal structure. Rather, it's a tax designation under the Income Tax Act. So you can set up a provincial society or provincial, in New Brunswick, I think it's a company with letters patent and a stated nonprofit purpose, or a trust, or even an unincorporated association. And all those organizations, regardless of their legal structure, can be a nonprofit organization. And under the Income Tax Act, the nonprofit organization status automatically applies to any organization that operates for, we'll say a social or community purpose, so long as no part of its profit is available for the personal benefit of any kind of members or directors. So it's a very encompassing designation that can accommodate organizations carrying out lots of social and environmental programming. And normally when you start out, you'll automatically be designated as a nonprofit organization. So in terms of how they're governed legally, that really depends how they're set up. So if you're an unincorporated association, maybe you have some bylaws and a constitution. Whereas if you're incorporated under, say, the Canada Not-for-Profit Corporations Act, your governance requirements will be dictated by that act. In terms of funding, the organizations will be eligible for nonprofit-oriented government funding streams. So Tim just mentioned the New Brunswick Environmental Trust Fund. I believe that fund will pay out to both nonprofit organizations, registered charities, and other organizations. However, a nonprofit organization would be ineligible for funding from a charitable foundation. So if you want to apply for funding from the McConnell Foundation or from a local community foundation, normally a nonprofit organization wouldn't be eligible. In terms of tax and receipting, so nonprofits don't pay income tax, don't pay GST, HST. They do pay payroll tax, and they can't issue tax receipts for charitable donations. So if you have an individual that wants to make a large donation, but will only do so if they can receive a charitable tax credit, that's often when nonprofit organizations encounter limitations associated with their tax designation. And in terms of reporting and maintenance, so we have T2 short corporate income tax return if the organization is incorporated, T1044 nonprofit information return, Both of those are filed with CRA. And then any corporate compliance obligations under the enabling legislation. Next slide, please, Tim. So registered charity, again, like a nonprofit organization, it's not a legal structure, it's a tax designation. There are three types, so charitable organization, public foundation, private foundation. So a charitable organization carries out the bulk of its programming independently. Public foundation disperses funds to other charities, so it's a grant-making organization, and it's publicly controlled. And a private foundation, like a public foundation, disperses funds, but it can be controlled by a group of people who are not at arm's length. So it may be a family or corporation or some group of individuals with an affiliation. So charities developed in the UK, and historically, there were 4 recognized categories of charitable purposes. So relief of poverty, advancement of religion, advancement of education, and other purposes beneficial to the community. And the ones that are most relevant for environmental organizations would be advancement of education, other purposes beneficial to the community. And we'll talk about some sample purposes later. And the key difference between a charity and a nonprofit is charitable status is not granted as a right. Rather, the organization must complete a detailed application process and be granted charitable status by the CRA Charities Director. And Amanda and I can kind of walk through what that was like for us. We worked together for probably almost a year preparing the charitable application, and then 6 to 8 months submitting it. So she had a lot of patience with me and can walk through what that was like. In terms of legal and governance, same as a nonprofit, that really comes from the enabling legislation that the organization is incorporated under, if applicable. For funding, eligible for nonprofit-oriented government funding streams. And again, a main difference relative to nonprofit is they would be eligible for foundation funding as well. So if you have a large charitable foundation with an endowment that is being distributed for environmental purposes, if you're organized as a registered charity, you are eligible to receive contributions or donations from that organization. But if you're not, if you're set up as a nonprofit, then you cannot. So tax and receipting, so same as a nonprofit, don't pay income tax, don't pay GST, HST normally, you pay payroll tax, and you can issue tax receipts for kind of individual and business donations. And you don't need to issue tax receipts for foundations. So I'll clean that up. And in terms of reporting and maintenance, so you have a T3010 annual information return, which is a very detailed document that the organization submits to CRA each year that contains information about the organization's finances, board of directors and trustees, and transactions with affiliates and also key employees. And when you file that, it's hosted online on the CRA's website, so everything's public. So it's many nonprofits report their financial statements anyway, but with a charity, you have basically a parallel reporting of that through a government on the government platform or system. And then like a nonprofit, you'll have additional corporate compliance obligations, that are a function of whatever your corporate legislation says. Next slide, please, Tim. So when Tim and I were preparing this, we wanted to provide you with some samples kind of charitable activities that match different categories of charitable purposes. And one thing to say at the outset is there's lots of kind of spillover and overlap between activities and charitable purpose categories. So you don't need to be too wedded to that kind of strict alignment. But I just wanted to put some of these down for you. So with relief of poverty, like I just as an example, put types of programming that may be using, say, energy efficiency, conservation, and renewable energy to reduce the kind of living costs of low-income households or persons. Advancement of education, environmental education in the formal school system is a big one that I know a lot of organizations do, and that Solar Schools does. Then you have public environmental education campaigns. So there's lots of, community-facing work going on in terms of raising public awareness about their ability to, say, adopt solar panels or perhaps purchase an EV if they own a vehicle. Environmental racism. And then one in the middle here, this is a little bit more creative, but environmental projects benefiting schools. So Solar Schools, the organization I started, we give money to schools to use to buy on a small scale school-based solar projects or solar equipment for use in classrooms. And then other kind of similar programs I know a lot of organizations do would be like gardens at schools, food programs, and other things. And then the third kind of category where a lot of environmental activities live would be environmental conservation and ecosystem preservation. So many of the land trusts and conservation organizations, they would be constituted under this kind of heading. Pollution reduction. That's an interesting one. It's kind of as more insidious forms of pollution have been recognized, like carbon, or carbon emissions or CO2 equivalent emissions. That's kind of broadened. So a lot of organizations are doing work in pollution reduction, whether it's say, I don't know, cleaning up really blatant forms of pollution like a landfill, to things like just climate action projects around decarbonizing our energy grid. Basically, this pollution reduction category of activities has broadened over time. Environmental restoration or remediation, environmental research. This last one, public policy and development activities, that's one that used to be subject to some restrictions, that if an organization had a charitable purpose and it wished to pursue that charitable purpose through, say, publishing policy papers or evaluating the policy platforms of different political parties in a nonpartisan way, organizations used to be restricted in that they could only devote 10% of their activities to those types of public policy and development activities. But that has changed and now it's unrestricted. But basically, you just need an alignment between your charitable purpose, the means of pursuing that charitable purpose through, I guess, participating public policy and dialogue activities, and having those activities be carried out in a nonpartisan way that doesn't favor any one political party in an overt way. So that's something Tim and I discussed that might be of interest, and I know a lot of organizations struggled with historically, but has since been kind of addressed through amendments to the Income Tax Act and then CRA policy papers. So Tim, next slide, please. Yeah, so this is just a set of guidelines to kind of indicate when it might be a good idea for your organization to apply for charitable status. So the first one is if you're established for purposes and you engage in activities that are legally charitable, and you don't need to, amend and restate your corporate purposes or really deviate from your core mission in order to fit within the range of what's considered legally charitable. Second, if your individual and corporate funders are, consistently requesting official donation receipts and you need that in order to get the funding you need to operate and grow. And if your organization's like an excellent fit for foundation funding, so TD Friends of the Environment, McConnell Foundation, Community Foundation, etc. And there's other kind of benefits available to charities. So let's say you want to move your online donation processing from, say, a commercial provider to Canada Helps. That reduces your transaction fees and enables Canada Helps to handle all your receipting. So for our organization, that saved us money and time. TechSoup's a really good resource for hardware and software donations for registered charities. So if we went from paying maybe 200 a year for email to $5 a month per user with a Microsoft donation available to charities. So those sorts of ecosystem contributions are welcome. Then the final one, you welcome the additional level of compliance, public transparency, and accountability that accompanies operating as a registered charity. And this one's a little more neutral because there are financial disclosure obligations associated with operating as a nonprofit organization, but I'd say they are a little bit more rigorous for registered charity. So next slide, Tim, please. So when not to apply for charitable status, I often have clients who come and say, we want to become a charity. And I think it's primarily driven by the desire to increase their potential donor base. But if their core purposes and programming do not neatly fall within what's charitable, they have to kind of go through these contortions and potentially amend their corporate purposes to be something that doesn't really match their mission, vision, and values and the kind of DNA for the organization. So in those circumstances, I typically advise organizations not to pursue charitable status if they're happy doing what they're doing and charitable status is really not open to them. Second factor would be, if you're delivering a service or a program and it's funded by users or government and there's no demand coming from your funders for official donation receipts, like the benefits of registering for a charity are less clear in that circumstance. So that's something to be mindful of. And those are the two main factors, but there may be others. So depending on how your nonprofit organization is incorporated and governed, there may be governance, public transparency, and accountability considerations, among others, that influence whether you remain organized as a nonprofit organization or pursue charitable status. So next slide, please, Tim. In terms of how to apply, So it is something you have to do, it's not granted as a right, as discussed earlier. The whole process has moved online now, so you need to set up a My Business account with CRA. You need to obtain a business number, obtain a pending RR charitable program account number, and then you apply to be a registered charity under that pending charitable program account via the CRA website, and you complete a detailed online registration form that requests a lot of information. It's kind of the particulars of the organization, very detailed information about its directors and officers, very detailed information about its income, expenditures, assets, and liabilities for the next financial year, historical financial information if available, all your corporate documents, and then a very detailed description of your purposes and the activities the organization carries out to fulfill those purposes. And the application portal allows you and invites you to provide, backup information. So, brochures, letters of support, photos of programming activities, publications, all that sort of stuff. So it's a detailed kind of submission, and there's quite a bit of kind of work involved in putting it together, but there are some red flags that sometimes it makes sense to engage a legal professional to flag and help you navigate. But I'd say if you're, well organized and good at administration, it's not outside the realm of possibility for an organization to do this kind of independently. And the final point is, sometimes organizations, they incorporate or they set up their charitable purposes, or their corporate purposes are not really drafted with a view to applying to become a charity, or say the organization's actual programming evolves over time such that it's no longer consistent with what is set out in the corporate governance documents. And in those circumstances, sometimes there's some kind of corporate governance or work or amendments to the corporate documents that needs to happen before you submit your charity application. So that's something that organizations should be prepared for as well. Next slide, please, Tim. And in terms of your primary compliance obligations, you need to devote all your resources to your charitable purposes and activities. That's pretty straightforward. Most organizations are committed to doing what they do. You need to file the Form T3010 document I talked about earlier. You need to spend a minimum amount on charitable activities or gifts to qualified donees, which is like a technical term for charities each year. It's fairly modest, 3.5% of the average value of property that's kind of not otherwise used in your operations. You need to keep complete, reliable books and records, issue accurate and complete official donation receipts, and comply with other legal requirements. So I've just identified a few here. Like they're quite precise rules relating to when a charity can engage in business activities and when they can't. Recently liberalized rules on engaging in public policy and development activities. Say the directors of registered charities are subject to heightened kind of fiduciary duties and standards of care around being mindful of conflicts of interest, avoiding self-interested transactions, and those sorts of ethical rules that apply to corporate governance. So those are just at a very high level, some of the key compliance obligations. But often what happens is, and Amanda can probably speak to this a little more, is an organization may be contemplating doing something new or partnering with a different organization. And if they've kind of recently become a charity, they just need to look at that new program or partnership through the lens of ensuring it doesn't trigger any specific rules that apply to charities. And you can do that by consulting the CRA Charities Directorate website, which maintains a very detailed list of policies and guidance documents that apply to different scenarios. And also, I'll always encourage clients to proactively just connect with the CRA Charities Director, give them a call if they ever have a question, and basically approach them as your friend and not as somebody who's there to stand in your way. So I think that's it. Tim, is there any other substantive slides after this one? No, so that's the end of my remarks in terms of my formal remarks.
Okay, thanks, Peter. I think that covers the basis. It's great information, and I guess I'll pass it off to this was actually Amanda's idea this week. I think it was a great idea, but we've been doing a series of capacity building workshops, and at one point she had suggested the process of becoming charitable, because it's something that EOS, as mentioned, has done over the last year or two. So invited Amanda to kick off kind of a discussion period and the Q&A by sharing her thoughts and her experience on what it's been like for EOS and what it continues to be like. So I'll pass it over to you, Amanda. And you guys can add your questions in the chat, or once we get going with the questions, you can use the raise hand feature. So go ahead, Amanda.
All right, thanks, Tim. Okay, well, great to see everybody this afternoon. And yeah, thanks, Tim, for organizing it. I think when I was trying to figure out, and EOS was trying to figure out whether we should take that leap, this sort of workshop would have been great. So I hope everybody is benefiting from it. And I wonder too, there may be some of you guys who are part of charities already, and you may have more experience than I have, because we only gained our charitable status around this time last year. So I'm sure I haven't come across all the challenges and questions and that sort of thing, but I'll let you know how it's been for us so far. So first off, if you're not familiar with EOS, EOS has been around for 18 years. And so 17, I guess, of those were as a nonprofit. We're based here in Sackville, but we serve the sort of entire Memramcook, Tantramar, southeast portion of New Brunswick. And we help our local communities, our residents, to respond to climate change. So we have a few different sort of key areas around sustainable energy, climate change adaptation, and most recently, we've also added in water quality monitoring work to the things that we do. And so we do research, we do monitoring, we do community planning with our local municipalities. We do a lot of education and public outreach with all ages in schools, the community, lots of different groups, and then action projects on the ground. So as I was telling Peter and Tim before we got started, I've just come back from the woods and from planting a community food forest at Fort Folly First Nation. And so really nice to do some actual work on the ground to make some change as well. So all of this work that we do, I guess, has sort of always been charitable. And so it really was just about making that leap and organizing ourselves. And so because we've been around for quite a while, I think it was sort of easy to wrap our heads around what our charitable purpose is once we realized what those purpose statements are like and how they're formulated. And then it was really great to work with Peter, because even though he didn't really know that much about EOS when we contacted him, he did the most excellent job of telling the story of EOS and putting all the parts and pieces together into a really nice application for us to CRA. And so we did partner on things, but Peter did a lot of the work for us. And so we were lucky to have some money at our disposal so that we could, so we could hire Peter to help us. And he really made the whole process, I think, a lot smoother compared to other groups that I had talked to who just talked about, a lot of back and forth with CRA, many months, and very huge documents, and a huge list of changes and edits and stuff that were needed. But I think our process was pretty smooth. I mean, I don't have a lot of different people to compare it to, but it wasn't as painful as I thought it would be. I think it was, it certainly took some lead up time to figure out, those purpose statements and go from there. But we applied, I think it was just like not December of this year, December last year, and then we heard back from CRA in June, and they only had like, I think 3 maybe points of clarification that wasn't too hard to address. And then we heard that we had our charitable status last July, and they made it retroactive to last April, actually. So let me just see what else I wanted to share with you guys. So really that process was, I would highly recommend it and recommend working with Peter or, with another lawyer in your area, because they really have that legal expertise and that, they can advise you on all that stuff. So it makes it easier for you. And then Tim also asked what charitable status means to us at EOS. And so I think that it has really helped us and helped others to, feel like our work is more justified. Absolutely nothing wrong with being a nonprofit, but to have that extra a little bit to say we're a charitable organization, and that just, it means something a little bit different to people. And so it's nice to be able to say that the work that we're doing is not only great for the environment, but is a charitable cause too. And so I really like that. It's already opened some doors to us. So we've already applied to a couple of foundations that we didn't have access to before, and we were successful with both of them. And that process of applying to foundations has been a lot simpler than applying to government grants. So they don't need nearly as much detail. It's been, a simple letter with what we want to do, and a check appears in the mail. And so that process has been really nice. I'm sure there are other foundations that do have bigger, more complicated application processes, but so far that's been a really nice, additional funding that we didn't have. And that was really one of our main causes for becoming a charity, was to diversify our revenue. And because we know that government grants are getting smaller, they're sometimes getting harder to obtain. And so we just wanted to have more options to choose from. We've also done some social enterprise stuff at EOS. And so going that charity route was just sort of the next step of trying to broaden our options. And we've already seen the benefits of that. And we have some plans certainly to apply to some other family foundations and things to kind of fill in some of the gaps where, if we're looking for something that's really important in our area, but we can't find a government grant that matches it, some of the foundations are a little bit more broader. And so we're keeping our fingers crossed that hopefully it will result in more options and that we can do more good work that's needed here. Also really nice to give out those tax receipts that Peter mentioned. So as a nonprofit all these years, we were able to accept donations, and certainly people have donated to EOS in the past, but I never made a really big push to ask for donations because I couldn't give that tax receipt. And so I just never did big sort of donor campaigns or anything like that. And so maybe we'll feel more comfortable doing that in the future and use our charitable status that way. One thing that I didn't realize until just the other week is our accountant has been doing up those annual forms that Peter mentioned. And she also said that because we're a charity, we are able to do up our HST return twice a year. So instead of just at the end of the year where we wait to get thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars back in HST, we can do that in September or like halfway through our year automatically. And so that just will help with our cash flow, because I don't know about your groups, but sometimes with a small organization, cash flow can be tight and can be an issue. And so that was kind of a happy bonus that I didn't realize would be part of this deal too. So that's another thing. And then in terms of making the leap, it hasn't really been like changed sort of business as usual for EOS, because what we were doing was already charitable. And I was also really lucky that our bookkeeper has experience working with other charities. So he was able to give me an example of a charitable tax receipt, because that seemed nerve-wracking to me at the beginning. And I'd heard that that can create problems for some groups if you don't have the right information or you're missing something. But our bookkeeper was like, nope, use this, it's all good, we've used it before. And so I was able to just sub in EOS's number and information. And then our accountant as well also has lots of experience with those charitable tax returns. And so she does that for us. We did have a lot of questions to answer. And as Peter said, there's definitely more sort of accountability and more transparency for sure. There's a lot more questions asked of us and what we did and how we did it and how much of our time was spent on administration and how much of our time was spent on projects, and we kind of had to think about things. So hopefully, you know, she's just submitting that this year. So hopefully it comes back okay and we've done everything correctly this year. But I'm really happy that I have people around me that have experience. So from Peter as our lawyer to our bookkeeper to our accountant, lots of good skills and support around me to make it all a success so far. And I think that's probably it, but I'm happy to answer any questions as best I can. And I also have questions, so maybe we can leave it there.
Great. Thanks, Amanda. That's really nice to have it kind of personalized a little bit. So there are already a bunch of questions, so I'll just read them off in the order they came in, and if the person who asked it feels like they need to compliment, please unmute. But Ray is the first one who chimed in, and Ray was wondering, once the application is complete, what the waiting time is like for acceptance.
So for EOS, it was like 6 months that we got an initial reply, I guess, to say we still need some clarification on these 3 points. And then it wasn't very long after that at all, was it, Peter? I can't remember now. It seemed like it was only a week or two that we then got notice of, yep, here's your charitable status.
Yeah, it takes basically, if your application is complete, the CRA will confirm that your application is complete within, say, 4 to 6 months. And then they will assign it to an officer within the Charities Directorate. And once it's assigned, the review time can be pretty short. So, you know, a month or two, and then they'll either provide you with a letter saying, here's your charitable status, good to go, or they'll come back and say, we have a few points of clarification we'd like to ask. And then once you respond to those, again, it's really quick, like maybe weeks and days if you satisfy the requests. And the third outcome would be, you know, you're absolutely not eligible for charitable status, and for these reasons. And then you do have some scope there to say, to whether clarify or demonstrate your willingness to make adjustments to the organization. So yeah, I'd say there's 4 to 6 months for an initial touch point, and then after it's assigned to a Charities Directorate officer, 2 months for a firm response, and then after that there could be some more back and forth.
Great. Next question, Kelsey was wondering, I think Amanda, this is probably for you, Amanda, but did you tap into specific funding to hire Peter? Is there programs out there to help the process?
No, we were just lucky. We got a large award from Eco 360, which is the Waste Commission here in Southern New Brunswick. A bunch of years ago, we got $10,000, and we were trying to figure out what to use it for. It was sort of, you know, for EOS in general. And so we decided to turn that money hopefully into more money and hire Peter to do a lot of this work for us. As he said, you could do it yourself, but I kind of recommend getting Peter or somebody like Peter to do some of it, because it's smoother for sure.
Okay, I'm wondering, I can't say this is true, but I wonder if LearnSphere would fund this through, they have customized support for nonprofit, and I know we're using it for strategic planning, but it can be for communications or other organizational things. It would be, could suggest people look into whether they would fund professional advice on becoming charitable.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Holly had a question, probably quick to answer, but in terms of getting your rebate back, your HSCs, does it change any, like, I know for us, isn't just a mere nonprofit is 50%, but did that increase the percentages you get back? Is it 50, 100? Is it something different?
I don't know. I think it's the same.
Yeah, I think it's 50%. The public service body rebate it was 50% for us this year.
Yeah, I was just gonna say, I just got the checks and they were not noticeably larger than in the past, so I think it's the same.
Okay, I'm going to read a question. Brad Nickerson, who had registered but had to bow out there at the last minute, he sent me a question by email, so I'm going to read that next. He was wondering whether his association needs to be a registered business, incorporated, or a co-op, or etc., with a business number before they can apply to become a CRA registered charity.
So they don't need to be incorporated, but they would require a business number, which you can apply for as an unincorporated entity through business registration online or by phone.
Okay, I'll pass that on to Brad. I wrote that down. Jill was wondering how charitable status has impacted things on the administration side. I think that's what you mean. Is there a significant increase in admin work?
Not for me as the executive director, not so far. And we've made it through a full year. Not really. I mean, when the accountant started to prepare our return for this year, there were a lot more questions than there were in the past. But I mean, it didn't even take me a full day to answer them and collect the things she needed. So no, I mean, it's definitely worth it for an extra day of work. But I guess it depends. Like if you're doing all your bookkeeping, all your accounting stuff on your own, then maybe there's a different answer there. But I mean, and then there's the charitable tax receipts. Now, we only got a handful of donations last year, so that didn't take very much more time. If we start to get a whole bunch of those, then I guess it would take more, but then we're also getting a whole bunch more money. And I guess you can also set limits. Like I didn't set a limit. So for any size donation, I'll give you a charitable tax receipt. If we end up getting inundated, then maybe that would change. I know some places like my kids' school, they're only going to give you a charity receipt if your donation is $20 or more. So you could always set, I think, a limit like that. But otherwise, no, it really, this past year hasn't been a whole lot different than previous years, other than we've been able to apply for funding in a few more places than we could before.
Interesting, yeah. I wanted to link in, last spring, we had a capacity building workshop on diversification of fundraising, and the person we brought in said that for small amounts, people don't really care about the tax receipt, so it shouldn't stop you from doing individual donor campaigns. But if you are looking for larger gifts, it really becomes something important. It's hard to get those larger gifts if you're not issuing the tax receipt, charitable tax receipt. Yeah. Any other questions in the chat? If not, I had one stored that I wanted to ask. I'm just curious, I guess, for Peter, like, I
have another.
Oh, go ahead, Holly. Didn't see.
No, that's okay. You can go ahead and then I can go after.
Sure. Mine is just about, you did a good job at explaining what charitable purposes qualify, but like what could disqualify you? Like if you're part of your mission is stuff that is not charitable, like clearly, like more in the advocacy realm, is it possible to separate the two, or does CRA kind of able to compartmentalize, like be like, okay, they do charitable work, but they're also doing this? Can you get in trouble for doing both, or is it even possible to go the charitable route if you're doing both?
Well, I guess it depends it depends on the relationship between your charitable purposes and the activities you carry out to fulfill those charitable purposes. So if you engage in advocacy activities and essentially interface with government as a means of fulfilling a charitable purpose, in those circumstances, it really doesn't matter how much you engage in advocacy activities, so long as those activities are tied, like appropriately tied or anchored to a charitable purpose. So just to try to illustrate that with some examples, like if your purpose, or I guess to use an example outside the environmental sector, I think the change to the liberalization of the rules around advocacy activities, that occurred because a organization, I think I read this before. What was it called? Canada Without Poverty. So they were an organization devoted to addressing poverty and homelessness. And rather than just alleviating the kind of impact of poverty and homelessness, they sought to shape policy in a way that kind of addressed the underlying cause of poverty and homelessness as an outcome. And the CRA said, you can't do that. And then they brought a charter challenge that said, yes, we can, because it's a legitimate way to advance our charitable purpose. And so long as we do it in a way that's politically nonpartisan, there should be nothing wrong with that. And the court agreed with their position, such that right now the law is you can engage in any type of advocacy activity, whether it's facing the public or facing government itself, so long as that is tied to a purpose that is otherwise charitable. So I guess to return to your question, if you have a different set of purposes, I guess advocacy as a freestanding purpose would only be charitable if it's tied to like a purpose in the whether it's advancement of education or other purposes beneficial to the community that's legally charitable. So advocacy itself is not charitable, but if it's tied to something that is, then it can become an activity carried out to fulfill a charitable purpose. Does that respond to your question, Tim? Sorry, it was a bit long-winded.
No, it's especially the example is really interesting. I think I'd heard of that case, and yeah, it helps. Yeah, thanks. Holly, do you want to ask your question?
Well, my questions are kind of similar to the other questions. I'm here from the Knowlesville Art and Nature Center in New Brunswick, and we're already a nonprofit organization. And I feel like already our mission and our purposes do fall under a lot of the qualifiable reasons. So we have so many things that we do here, though. So we get grants and we carry out a lot of environmental work and gardening, but we also have essentially a private school running here for children, and they pay, a small tuition, as small as we can, with our grant funding to make the school work, to pay our teachers. So I guess I'm wondering where we bring in monies from individuals. And when I was reading through the CRA website, to be charitable, you're working for a community, for the public at large. And where we are in like rural New Brunswick, our public tends to be a smaller geographical area. So I wasn't sure if that would be a challenge for us as well.
So I can handle that question. And there's almost three questions embedded in that. There's,
right.
You have a broad set of purposes and activities. Fee for service, and then are your beneficiaries a sufficiently kind of broad set of group in the public?
Mm-hmm.
So for the broad set of activities, that like those won't be a barrier to you putting together a charitable status application if each kind of purpose and corresponding activity is legally charitable. But it does, like the broader the broader you go, the more of a, I guess, an administrative burden it is to tell the CRA what the purpose is, what activities you carry out to fulfill those purpose, and then, satisfy any tests or requirements set out in their policy documents and provide supporting activities, supporting evidence. So basically the broader your purposes and activities, the kind of larger your application for charitable registration will be. So that does create some administrative heavy lifting. And in that sense, it does make sense sometimes to focus and maybe go a little bit narrower if you can. But if that involves kind of departing from your organization's reason for being and kind of leaving needs unserved in your community, then I probably wouldn't do that. I'd probably just do a really, really good job of, as Amanda said, telling the story of what your organization does, how it does it, and why it does it. And I guess, Amanda, like EOS Eco Energy's purposes are pretty broad as well, like quite broad, and that certainly wasn't a barrier. Like I think we probably had 5 or 6 different sets, like narrative descriptions of what the organization does. We broke it down into 5 or 6 categories. So that's probably what I recommend for your organization. And for the fee for service, that's totally fine. So long as your team is not lining its pockets by charging inordinate fees to members of the community. And you're really just, your fees are charged on a cost recovery basis, and the overall program itself is subsidized by other sources of income. Like that's not a problem at all. And if you liken that to, a university, for example, they charge universities are all charities, but they charge pretty high fees, but they're still operated on a cost recovery basis rather than for a profit if it's a public university in Canada. So the fee for service is fine. And the beneficiaries, I mean, that's the fact that you're serving a segment of the broader public that is limited by geography. That's also, that's totally fine. Like your programming doesn't have kind of arbitrary distinctions about who can attend and who can. It's just serving a need in a defined community. So that doesn't fall offside those CRA rules around delivering a public benefit to the public at large. So do those responses address your questions, Holly?
Yeah, very much. Thank you. And I like how you talked about like our purpose and kind of breaking it down, which our board has been trying to do lately. We're trying to end up with like 4 pillars of our mission or the services we offer. It's just so driven by our grant funding. So like we tend to qualify for these really specific grants to carry on a very specific project. So that really leads, what we do in that particular year. But yeah, that answers my question a lot. I think maybe we're in good shape.
Yeah, I think that's it. It's about striking a balance between making your charitable purpose broad enough so that you can still do all the different things. And that's what I struggled with. I was like, we do something different every year because it depends on what grant we get. You can't keep doing the same thing with the same grant, but being specific enough that CRA would like it. So I did just cut and paste our charitable purposes into the chat there, just as an example, because it worked. And so you might, see if something like that works for you, or how you can fit your pieces into it. But yeah, as Peter said, EOS does a whole lot of different stuff. And so we were able to pull out some of the big things that we do and made our purposes broad enough that things will fit under there, and hopefully we'll be all right going forward.
Okay, I love that. And I actually had one more question. I'll just ask it now if that's okay. Like, you talked about the tax return that you have to do, but there's no requirement for an audit. Like, when your accountant is doing up your year-end return, it's not like an assurance engagement or an audit of any type?
Well, we had her do, so in the past, she's done notice to readers for us, which is the lowest level review, and that's what our bank needed, just because we've always had a line of credit, just in case I get into that cash flow problem. We've been good so far. But so this year we did a compilation engagement, and we'll have to see going forward, because at our AGM, one of our members said, oh, you know, do you guys need an audit, or is this enough? And I said, well, the accountant said it's enough because we haven't had grantors or foundations say they need anything more from us, but we may get to a situation where we'd like to apply to a foundation, but they want audited statements in our application, and so that won't work for us. So we'll have to see what happens, but going forward we may end up having to shell out more money for a full-on audit. But this has only been the first year, but so far we're okay. But
you did have to do a compilation this year, like a review engagement.
Yeah, compilation engagement.
And that was a requirement by CRA?
No, I don't know. Well, I don't know now, actually. But I know that our members and that the board and stuff, we just wanted a little bit of a higher level review just to make sure. So yeah, and I mean, I think that was about $3,300 or something it cost us for that level.
Yeah. Okay.
All right.
I'm a CPA, but I can't do that. So
yeah.
Okay.
I'm gonna check the time here. It's 1, so we're gonna put an end to this workshop. But I mean, of course, if Amanda or Peter wants to stay on, but there's no obligation. I think it was a lunch and learn. I thought that was great, Peter. Thanks for the really kind of clear information, and Amanda for sharing your experience, and everyone else for attending. I'll do a follow-up with, if that's all right, Peter. I didn't ask, but those are your slides. People requested your PowerPoints, so I'll share that by email along with this recording and a few other links that you mentioned, things that you mentioned. So you'll receive that by email. And yeah, good luck if you decide to pursue this. I hope it goes well. And that's it. Have a good afternoon. And thank you so much, Peter and Amanda.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye.
Nice to meet everybody.
Yeah.
See you later.
Bye.
Bye.